The Gaza Strip, known the world over for its ceaseless battles between Palestine and Israel, is home to some 2.3 million people. The Palestinian territory is considered one of the most densely populated regions in the world. Labor and trade are restricted across its borders with Israel and Egypt. Ruled by the terrorist organization Hamas, it is blanketed in poverty and everyday freedoms are withheld as people live in constant fear. Almost a fifth of children under the age of 5 are malnourished, and there are frequent shortages of water, electricity, and medicines. It is probably the last place in the world where you would expect to find a zoo. However, in the southern Gaza town of Khan Yunis, a small private zoo called Azda Park is one of the few that are open to the public. Situated just 2.5 miles east of the Mediterranean Sea, it is the second largest city in Gaza and is known for its open-air markets, or souks. The neighboring Khan Yunis Zoo was labeled as the worst zoo in the world, and locals condemned the treatment of the animals. Those that died, mostly from starvation, were taxidermied by zoo staff and stuffed for visitors to view on arrival. In fact, those animals, unlucky enough to still be living at the zoo, had to share their quarters with the dead. And in one case, a tigress had to share her enclosure with the stuffed corpse of her former mate. Mercifully, that zoo shut down in 2016. But Azda Park Zoo opened in 2010 as part of an entertainment complex. The animals are treated equally as poor as the neighboring zoos, and it is also widely condemned for the suffering of the animals. But for some, it is an enjoyable day out. It provides entertainment for families in Gaza who have little else in the most politically volatile place in the world. With local government resources going towards the ongoing war and a poverty rate of around 60%, there is little in the way of funds for the animals at the park. There is no medical care available to them, and food supplies are scarce. Some are said to be in a state of starvation, and there have been rescues by various charities over the years to give the animals a better life. The park receives on average of 50 visitors a day, each paying the equivalent of $50 for entry. But to feed its larger animals, the zoo would need to have spent between $30 and $40 each and every day to buy between 20 and 30 kilograms of meat. The animals inside are desperate, and desperate animals can be exceptionally dangerous. On May 2, 2023, 6-year-old Hamada Ikhtiat was visiting the zoo with his family. As they wandered around the grounds, they made their way to the lion enclosure. Inside were 2 lions, a male and a female. The enclosure was bleak, with gray concrete floors and thick metal bars surrounding it. The lions were fed minimal meat and had no environmental stimulation whatsoever. It also seems that it didn't have adequate protection for the viewing public. With such badly treated animals, there was a disaster waiting to happen. One witness reported seeing zoo staff beating the lioness while they retrieved her 3 cubs. They removed the young so that they could play with some of the visitors, an extra form of entertainment for the paying guests. They then tormented the lioness, who was kept in a cage 7 square meters in size. A lion needs a minimum of 1,000 square meters when held in captivity. The conditions they were kept in was nothing short of evil and inhumane. It was the wildlife charity 4 Paws that convinced the zoo to close in 2016. They managed to rescue almost 50 animals, and the owners were in agreement with the charity that they would remain shut. However, miraculously, shortly afterwards, it reopened. Some think that this was to blackmail the charity into giving them money to rescue the animals. 4 Paws had indeed paid money, but this was to cover the cost of medical bills and food to ensure the animals were well enough to be transferred to more suitable parks and sanctuaries around the world. Whilst his mother's back was turned, young Hamada squeezed between a gap in the outer fencing of the lion enclosure. He wanted to see the lions better. He wanted to get closer. He stood next to the cage bars, and, when he did so, one of the lionesses trotted over to him. He could see her beige-brown fur, the size of her paws, and her large, round eyes as she stared at him. In less than a few seconds, she stood just inches from Hamada. Then, without warning, She reached through the gaps in the bars with her paw. Her claws, 4 inches long, protracted as she grabbed the 6-year-old and yanked him towards her. The little boy screamed, and his mother wheeled around to see her son's head in the jaws of the lioness. The warm stench of her breath filled his nostrils, the sandpapery tongue rough and wet on the top of his head. The lion was pulling and tugging at the young boy. She was trying to pull him into her cage. The boy's tiny, helpless body was limp and at the mercy of the lioness as he was repeatedly pulled back and forth between the bars. It was as though he was trapped. He couldn't get out. He was stuck between the bars and now was held in the lioness's jaws. The pain must have been indescribable for the terrified youngster as the lion's canines sank into his skull. Security personnel rushed to the scene. They ran to the bars and pulled at Hamada, but the lioness refused to let go. Her 3-inch-long canines crunched down on his skull. Blood poured from the open wounds on his head. He could feel the intense pain from her sharp claws as they dug into his flesh, curled around so as not to let him go. The officers beat the lion through the bars until she eventually released her grip, but the damage was done. Little Hamada, with blood pouring down his face and spilling onto the concrete ground, was rushed off to hospital. The doctors fought to save him, but the injuries he had sustained were too great, and he passed away with his mother by his side. It was a terribly tragic incident, and the first reported case of a killing by a wild animal in Gaza. The lioness is one of about 40 big cats still thought to be held captive in Gaza. They were smuggled in from Egypt in underground tunnels when they were cubs and have lived a life of misery ever since. The Four Paws charity had been involved with animal rescues in Gaza before. Another zoo, Rafah Zoo, was in a terrible state. Animals had been subjected to rocket attacks during a conflict. A female lioness had been declawed, leaving her with a life-threatening infection and in serious pain. 3 lion cubs froze to death without the necessary care and shelter provided, and all of the animals were kept in tiny, dirty cages. In 2019, Four Paws rescued 47 animals from the appalling conditions and rehomed them in sanctuaries. The zoo was then closed. Sadly, the same couldn't be said for Azda Park Zoo. Not only was the zoo so poorly funded that it left the animals malnourished and aggressive, but it didn't have the proper infrastructure in place to provide safe viewing for the visiting public. In countries like the UK, there are laws in place to ensure zoos and their animals are well looked after. A zoo must hold a license, staff must be qualified, and the animals must be kept for educational, conservation, or research purposes only. There are strict conditions for the animals that must be met. These are loosely based on these 5 freedoms: freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from discomfort, freedom from pain, injury, or disease, freedom to express normal behavior, freedom from fear and distress. It is clear that Azda Park Zoo doesn't provide a single one of these freedoms for its animals. Following Hamada's death, the zoo was temporarily closed whilst an investigation into the attack was carried out. But it won't be long before it is opened back up again, and the inhumane treatment of the animals persists. The family of Hamada had witnessed the 6-year-old being mauled to death. It was a tragic and terrible waste of such a young life in a war-torn region. But the authorities' sequence of events differed from that of the families. They said that the boy had climbed over the top of the exterior fence and then dropped down inside the lion's enclosure. It was no wonder that he was attacked. But for his mother and the rest of his family not to notice him scaling the perimeter fence seemed unlikely. Either way, it was a tragic end to the family's day out. There were fresh calls to end the misery and suffering of those animals and to rethink the safety measures in place at one of the world's worst zoos. But nothing has changed. It is only a matter of time before someone else like Hamada meets their terrifying final affliction.